Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Tell Me Yours, a storytelling podcast with me, your host, Trey Everett. Hello and welcome to another episode of Tell Me Yours. Today on the pod, I have an incredible guest for you. Not only is he a really dear friend, he also happens to be the founder and CEO of two amazing organizations. Seth Maxwell is on the pod today. Seth started the Thirst Project as well as Legacy Youth Leadership, two really incredible organizations that are quite literally changing the world. I've personally known Seth for a number of years. We went to college together, and he's just all around a fantastic guy. I was so excited that he gave some time to connect and be on the pod and share his story. The Thirst Project also happens to be one of the inspirations to the book that I wrote, Beneath the Surface. Head over to blackrosewriting.com, pop in the promo code TELLMEYOURS. My publisher is giving 20% off to my podcast listeners. So not only has he impacted the world and hundreds of thousands of lives across the world, but he's also had a great impact on me as an artist and as a person in general. That being said, please welcome to the pod, Seth Maxwell. How are you, man?
I'm so good. How are you, buddy?
I'm good, man. It's so good to see you.
So good to see you.
I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was like, man, I feel like Seth is just one of those friends that I have where we can go a super long time and not interact, but the moment I see Seth, it's like nothing. It's like we pick up right back where we left off. I was like, I always just feel like we're like right back where we were.
I think that's partly because we are both ageless.
Fair, and I appreciate you saying that.
You look today as you did 15 years ago. So
I could say the exact same about you. How have you been, man?
Bro, I'm good. I am friggin' crazy busy.
Yeah.
I feel like that's such a blasé answer. Everyone, I feel like you ask me like, oh, how are you? Like, oh, I'm crazy. But like, there's so much being juggled. So
yeah, you're always doing something. I love it.
We out here trying.
That's so good. I was thinking about this before we connected. 2020 was that year, which it's crazy to think about how 2020 is already almost 2 years ago. Like certain milestones are going to be 2 years ago, which is insane to think about. I know what I went through professionally, like kind of pivoting through 2020 to figure out how to do my job differently. I'm very curious what you all went through, with Thirst Project, but now it seems like that was kind of the time where you were also sort of starting to launch this other organization. Like, what was that experience like for you in terms of not only starting to build something completely new, but then also having like such a strong foundation with Thirst Project created, and now having to figure out how to pivot during that, like what we thought was going to be 2 weeks, and then what we thought was going to be 3 months, and then what we hoped would only be 6 months, and then what has turned into the last forever.
Remember when we were like, wouldn't it be crazy if we were locked down for like 2 weeks? Wouldn't that be crazy?
I was literally just talking to one of my leaders at my job, and he was like, I remember standing at your desk, and he was like, I only thought we were going to be gone for 2 weeks. And he's like, and I remember you said, no, I think we'll be out until summertime. And he goes, and here we are.
Yeah, dude, it's wild. It's, it's super interesting because there are sort of two very different experiences that I had to sort of try to like navigate and walk through. One was, what does operating in this new reality look like for leading Thirst Project? But the other was how do we launch something in a pandemic, which, it's interesting because in some ways what we built, COVID created the environment, really gave us the material with which we would actually build the programs as we know it now at Legacy. And I don't know I think we would have gotten where we are, but I don't know if we would have gotten there as quickly because so much of what we had done in working with students, at Thirst Project, and then what we began building for Legacy was always thought of and built and constructed through the lens of like a physical in-person experience with students. And,
interesting.
And there is something to be said, we are human beings, like we need to be connected, and there is nothing from a lasting perspective that will ever be able to replace what we refer to at least Legacy as like the primacy of face-to-face. But what is interesting is that it is also much more limited in terms of scale, right? Which is super obvious. And so I'm sure whenever we reached a tipping point of like, hey, we've reached as many schools and students as we can without just the enormous cost of producing in-person experiences. What does that next version look like of a more digital program? That probably would have come a few years down the line. And so it not only accelerated that process, but it also sort of, I think, switched up the order where we're like, oh no, like our bread and butter, like our primary program is this digital program. Anyways, I'm rambling about like,
No, I love it. It's all so interesting, honestly.
so it's been fun to build.
All right, that being said, I know
Yeah.
you're a very busy man. We are connecting today because you are going to tell me a story,
Yes.
and I'm all yours.
Yeah, so I moved to LA when I was 18. I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
For a brief period, lived in a suburb of Chicago, but kind of bounced back and forth between that area as a kid growing
I
up.
don't think I knew that. What took you to Chicago?
Well, I mean, I was 4 until I was
Oh,
a
God.
so
You're hitting the clubs.
no opportunity is what took.
Oh, perfect.
Uh,
That's so
oh
good.
no, but yeah, we moved, as a
Cool.
family, actually a fair bit growing up, and but I started telling stories when I was really young, whether it was doing community theater into like professional theater,
Mm-hmm.
and did some like horrible local commercials. And so when I graduated and moved to LA, like everyone else in this city,
Yeah.
I'm gonna pursue entertainment. And it was while I was here actually when we first got to know each other.
Mm-hmm.
At that point in my life, I was. This is not like just something to say. Like I was arguably the most selfish, like introspectively
Oh,
focused person
interesting.
on the planet. Like when I say that, what I mean is like I really didn't care about a whole lot unless it had to do with my like aspirations for the things I wanted to do
Yeah,
here.
yeah. That
Whether
resonates. Absolutely.
producing, and
Totally.
which I think is also maybe relatively normal for a 19-year-old. But
Especially a 19-year-old that just moved to Los Angeles.
right,
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I was also one of those few. Yeah.
you're like, but no, I had a friend who was a photojournalist, and she was given this really crazy assignment. It was like in conjunction with like Nat Geo and the United Nations, and basically at the turn of the millennium, which was about 10 years prior to when this happened, this moment I'm about to tell you the story about
Mm-hmm.
happened, the UN released this report and this plan called the Millennial Development Goals, which would later kind of be rebranded as the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. But
Mm.
basically, initially, some of the concept behind these 15 goals was here's what we as a global community need to do to eradicate extreme global poverty.
Hmm.
Most people define as people living on $1.25 a day or less, and then the impact that comes as a result of that relative to health issues, access to food security,
Yeah, for
education
sure.
opportunities, etc. And so this is fast forward from 2000 to 2008, 2009. My friend was like sent on this assignment because they were like, hey, we're coming up on it will soon be a decade into this process. Let's report on the progress that's been made. And so she went and lived for 6 weeks at a time in different communities across Southeast Asia, South and Central America,
Oh,
all
wow.
of Africa. And she was working in communities where people were making efforts to make strides towards these goals. And so
Mm-hmm.
when she came back after what amounted to about a year and a half of being gone, we got together to catch up over coffee. And I sat across from her, sort of stunned for 45 minutes, listening to incredible stories of
Yeah.
people she had met and worked with. But what was super interesting, the photos that she showed weren't just like poverty porn, like, oh, look at this sad kid or look at this,
Yeah.
difficult condition. But what was interesting, besides the fact that there were these really meaningful sort of in-depth stories, like, oh no, like I spent 6 weeks with this person watching their life every day. Besides that, though, what was really fascinating for me was there was this common through line she kept coming to where she was like, man, we as a global community are trying to make strides to address hunger and food insecurity, but you can't do that without first addressing water, right? You can't develop agricultural initiatives without water.
Yeah,
So it
yeah, yeah,
turns
yeah.
out if you care about hunger, you care about water. Or, we're trying to make strides in education access and building schools and outfitting them with teachers, but you can't bring education into a community if all of the kids in that community are out walking for 6 or 7 hours each day to collect water, or if
Yeah.
they're home sick with preventable waterborne diseases. So it turns out if you care about education, you care about water. And at that point, hearing about the health impact of not having access to safe water, I was just struck by, I mean, A, how severe it was, B, how massive in scale it was. At that time, we're talking about 13 years ago to date myself. There were over a billion people, right? It was 1.1 billion people who at that point in time didn't have access to safe, clean drinking water. And I was like, that's the stat. Like, imagine a billion anything,
Yeah,
right?
it's like
But
it's like an unimaginable number, like a
it is like
truly
can't,
unimaginable number. Yeah.
you can't fathom, like, much less a billion people.
Yeah.
I was like, how? And then when, I started digging into what that actually meant, besides just being a big number, and you're like, oh, this means that like every day, women and kids will walk really long distances from their homes to collect water out of rivers, mud puddles, swamps, open, unprotected sources that are shared with animals that drink and defecate in the same water sources that people drink from. And then as a result, people get really easily preventable waterborne diseases like
Hmm.
dysentery, diarrhea, cholera. And then when you found out at the time, like, man, 13 years ago, it was like almost 5,000 kids were dying every day from drinking dirty water, like preventable waterborne
Yeah.
diseases. And so I went to school at the time and
Hmm.
started talking to my friends. And I was like, yo, you guys have no idea what's going on in the world. We need to do something, right?
You were like, Seth, could you not right now? I'm trying to practice my monologue.
I'm reading Alyssa Strada, okay? Uh, and so yeah, so I conned all my friends into helping me do these like super ragtag like makeshift events around town, like on World Water Day in 2008 was really the first sort of significant thing that we ever did. We bought as many bottles of water as we could, and we went out on Hollywood Boulevard, and our like brilliant plan was we're just going to give away free water so that people will talk to us and say, why are you doing this? So that we could raise awareness and say, did you know this is happening? Did you know
Mm,
this is going on? And challenge people to look at this issue, because I was like, man, at that point I thought a decently well educated person. And I was like, how before that meeting had I never heard of this? And so we talked to about 1,000 people in one day.
that's crazy to think about
We were
too.
literally like in front of the Gap on Hollywood,
Yeah.
which I don't think
I think it's
exists.
a Footlocker now.
Yeah, it's gone. But we were like, we had gas cans full of water, and
Mm,
we said, hey, like, when you fill a jerry can, which is what most people in the developing world use to carry their water every day, when you fill a 5-gallon jerry can full of water, it weighs 44 pounds. That's crazy. See what
that
it
is
would be like if
crazy.
you were forced to rely on these local water sources. And so people donated to us, which we were like, well, we're not an organization. So we gave money to an organization that was building water projects, and honestly kind of thought like that would be it.
Yeah.
Really good. I was like, cool. We raised some awareness. I can go back to like living my very selfish life.
Mm,
Um, but there were two people who met us that day and exchanged info and said, hey, would you guys come to our school? Basically tell our friends what you told us. We want to see if we can do
that's
something similar.
cool.
So we did. We went and spoke at these two schools, and then again, kind of forgot about it. And a month later, they called us and said, hey, we did fundraisers and sent us checks made out to the Thirst Project, which is like what we were calling like our little group,
Hmm.
like our little club. And we were like, oh man, like we can't deposit. Like there is no such thing as the Thirst Project. But we were like, well, clearly there is tremendous untapped potential in people our age around this issue. And if
Mm,
this is what two schools could do, what if there were 100 schools? What if there were 1,000 schools? And so we created the Thirst Project. And for the last 13 years, what it's worked to do is educate high school and college students about that issue and get them to do something about it, whether that is a awareness campaign, a walk, a fundraiser. And for those students who like raise money, we committed to give 100% of all the money they raised directly to build water projects without taking anything to operate off of. So we built a pretty incredible group of donors led by our board, who cover all of our operating expenses, so that we could tell students that. But since we started, students, young people have done incredible things, dances, walks, video game tournaments. And in 13 years, we've worked with about 2.2 million high school and college students at about 1,100 campuses across.
That's incredible.
Who've helped us bring 500,000 people safe, clean water for the rest of their lives. So that's kind of been,
that's wild, man.
Yeah, that was, kind of like a defining thing for my life for the past 13 years. But as we were just talking about before you started recording, there's now new stuff happening.
Yeah. So because I know one thing Thirst Project has obviously done for a very long time to great success is like actually traveling around the country and going to these different campuses across the country to speak with student bodies in their schools. Is that something that like came about fairly quickly, the idea to like, hey, let's get boots on the ground and like let's go out into the country and do this? Or do you remember how that kind of came about to like becoming what the kind of focus was?
To going and speaking in school.
Yeah, it's actually like, let's put a team together and like let's actually go out into schools. Because now, if I remember correctly, you actually like recruit from students around the country and send them to schools around the country. Yeah. Is that right? That's so freaking cool.
So most things that happened that would eventually become like systems and structure at Thirst Project initially happened by accident. So, the reason we began going and speaking at schools is because like those first two students that asked us to come speak at their school asked us to do so. And we did. And we were like, well, okay, if this is, how can we, the question was like, how do we reach as many students as possible with this message, organize an all school assembly, which, in the world we live in today is like a very difficult and very different. But, for 13 years or, 12 years of leading Thirst Project pre-COVID, that was like the sweet spot, was if we could get an all school assembly, that was a huge win.
That's so cool. During COVID, did that initiative sort of make that same transition to doing it like virtually?
Yeah. So it's interesting. COVID forced us to, like everybody, right? Everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
COVID forced us to reimagine how we could get that message in front of as many students as possible. And in so many ways, obviously COVID was devastating, but also for us, a lot of ways, COVID actually really forced us to think about how we could scale. And we already had worked with so many schools and students, but pushing us completely digital, which is what we've been for the last 2 years. And, we hope that we'll be able to return to some sort of hybrid version. But in the meantime, it forced us to figure out, how do we identify where there are school communities and student communities where we can get in front of them and make impact without having to spend, the cost to produce the school tour was pretty expensive.
I bet
the nonprofit, like, we have to be really judicious about how we allocate resources. But no, it really has allowed us to reach more schools and more students.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Much lower cost. Is super interesting. Now, you lose some of that, that magic of what happens when you are physically in the same place and in front of people. And so, like I said, we hope that we'll get back to some sort of hybrid, but yeah, it's been in a lot of ways really positive. And I think whenever we are on the other side of figuring out what living with this looks like and being in person again, the hope is we'll be able to use both and do it really well. But
for sure.
To the point of like recruiting other students, that happened probably 3-4 years into the organization's life. So, the first year and a half, 2 years, like I was the only speaker. I was also like, I did everything, right? I was the only full-time anybody. So
yeah.
I was like making all of our social media posts and like working with our PR firm and like working to fundraise and organizing events and coordinating water projects and, speaking at schools. And so about 2.5-3 years in, I think I spoke at like 90 schools
Oh my
in,
gosh.
in one semester. That was one semester, not even.
Oh my gosh.
And I was just exhausted, and I was like, this is not sustainable. And so that was what started us figuring out how to imagine what would eventually be our school tour program now. But what also started to happen even after we built the school tour program that began bringing in other speakers that I would work with and train to go give this presentation, we also realized, like, I was getting older, and so much of what it may sound ridiculous, but like, so much of what works at Thirst Project, specifically with the messaging, the way we designed it, is like, it is core to who we are, that we say, like, you don't have to be older, you don't have to have more money, you don't have to have a higher education even to make a real impact on this issue. And what is fascinating is, a 28-year-old or a 30-year-old doesn't resonate with a 15-year-old the way that I did when I was 20, 21, 22. There is
Super interesting.
Something powerful about another young person standing on stage saying, like, we will be the generation to push this into the history books.
Yeah.
And so I would like to say that it was like self-awareness to be like, yo, like, I am an old person, right? Like, and this happened before I was 33. Like,
Yeah.
once I hit like 25, 26, like, once there's a decade between you and the audience you're talking to, you are suddenly no longer young. And
Oh, it's
so,
so interesting to think about that way.
yeah. And so I think being like, oh, I got to get off the road, and we got to find other young people who we can put out there to be this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like spot on, because I think it has to come back to that, like, I mean, it's just a question of representation in a different way of like yeah, like you said, it's so much more powerful to see something and see yourself in it, and when you're looking at something that you just can't see yourself in, it's like natural just to like not listen to it as much. And so that kind of led, kind of going into COVID, making all of those pivots and all of those changes. That kind of led you to start this new organization. I'm curious, like, is there overlap between the two, or are you kind of treating this as like a spinoff series, or is this like a completely like separate? Like, the goal is for it to be completely separated organizations with like no overlap.
Yeah. So the goal is definitely for them.
This is not the Golden Palace, and you already did the Golden Girls. You know what I mean? Like, this is a completely.
I should probably get that reference, and I was like, I know what the Golden Girls are. I don't know what the Golden Palace is.
I've never watched the Golden Palace, but apparently after Golden Girls, there was a new series with only 3 of them, and they buy a casino, and it was called the Golden Palace.
Oh, no. There's probably a reason I haven't heard of it, right? Like, no disrespect to their late great Betty White or anything.
Yes.
But, so this is so yes, to back up, a couple years ago, and I was telling you kind of before we started recording, like a couple years ago, we started asking a different question. We'd always ask the question, like, how can we raise as much money as fast as possible to build as many water projects as fast as possible? Because the water crisis is, for all that it is incredibly daunting, it's incredibly solvable. I mean, as a global community, we have seen in the last 13 years, the number of people without safe water go from 1.1 billion to a little less than 700 million.
It's incredible.
So, I mean, the number of people without safe water has almost been cut in half while the global population has risen. So we will absolutely see the end of this issue.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Not just in our lifetimes, like in the next 15, 20 years.
That's amazing.
So, but what was interesting was that while it was, noble to ask how much money we could raise as fast as possible from students, we said, well, it was always really easy to measure the impact on the water crisis in terms of number of people with safe water, reduction of waterborne disease. But it was much harder to pinpoint the impact we were making in the lives of students or the young people that were helping us make that impact, right? But we knew we were making it, if only for the fact that I would get emails or cards or tweets from students who I had never met before, literally, that said things like, man, thank you so much for starting Thirst Project. If it wasn't for Thirst Project, I don't know what the highlight of my senior year would have been. But like, that's very qualitative. And so we were like, well, what is the value we create in the life of a student? And so we worked with a group of social scientists for 2 years, And their sole job was to study students who went through our programs and pinpoint the change that occurred in those students, right? Skills they developed, things they could do that they couldn't do before they started working with us, and could we identify what those things were and how we accomplished that. And so we found that there were really like 14 specific hard and soft skills that these young people developed as a result of working with these programs. Fundraising, yes, was one of them, but it was only one of about 14 things like communication and public speaking, organization and strategic planning, goal setting, social emotional development. And
That's so cool.
These were amazing things that were all happening by accident. Like we weren't trying to achieve those outcomes. And we were like, man, what if we did? Like if we were to design programs to do that, these were things that students could use to make an impact on not just the water crisis, but any issue or cause they cared about. And so to give each of those things the attention and resources they deserved, we created a completely separate organization called Legacy Youth Leadership. And Legacy's mission is to develop young people's leadership skills, but specifically so they can make impact in their world by taking action around the causes they care about the most. And it's cause agnostic, students who care deeply about climate change or gender equality or racial justice can go through these programs, learn these skills, and then apply them by taking action around whatever that issue or cause they care about, even if it's not the water crisis.
Totally.
And, the programs themselves, they're basically sort of like masterclass for helping young people change the world. So they're time sensitive. You can't go at your own pace. You have to go in, with a cohort. You're not on your own. You're with a group of 30 to 40 other like-minded students from around the world. They're like half digital pre-record lessons, half live sessions. And it's been pretty incredible to see what students have done as they've gone through it. But, that they are two completely different organizations. The one was born out of the other. So there's a lot of crossover right now in board representation. There's, about like 70% of the boards are the same, although we've begun to get a little bit more diversified representation. And then, the staffs are pretty much completely different now, which is great. But initially sort of started very kind of intertwined.
For sure.
The goal is, yes, they are right now legally, they are two different organizations. They have two different missions. Board, Thirst Project is still hyper focused on ending the water crisis, and Legacy is hyper focused on developing these skills in young people. The programs are free, by the way, for students. They don't have to go.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah. So eventually the goal is to get to the place where there's less than 50% same representation on each board, so that each board can really make decisions without worrying about the impact of the one on the other. But
totally. Yeah. That's awesome, man. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Where can I point people towards to learn more about both of these things?
Yeah. So if you want to learn about Thirst Project, you can just go to thirstproject.org or at Thirst Project on pretty much any social channel. And then for Legacy, it's legacyyouthleadership.org or at Legacy Youth Lead for all social channels. But yeah, it's been a super fun, kind of crazy journey. I can tell you lots of stories about different things throughout the process. You let me know what is.
Honestly, everything you just shared is like perfect. That's like exactly what we came for.
We did it.
We did it. You did it.
Did it.
You did it, Seth. You did it.
I was pressed.
I love it. Well, speaking of that, thank you for doing this. And
thank you
it's just great to see you as always.
It's so good. I want to see you in person. So
yes, please. I'm boosted and ready to go.
Same. I don't know if you've had. I have not had COVID that I know of.
Sneaky minx, yeah.
But and I've been very cautious. I'm boosted and
for sure
things, but I'm also like, man, I do feel like I'm like Neo in the Matrix. Just like I don't know how. I'm COVID left and right. But. Yeah,
that is so funny. I had it in June of 2020, and it was like one of those things where again, like I was quote unquote doing everything right, and it still happened. So I was like, all right, well, luckily for me, it was like incredibly mild, which I'm grateful for. But But yeah, Vax boosted. You want to give me a fourth booster? Just inject it into my face. I don't care. I'll take it. Yeah. You want to feed it in my breakfast? I don't care. I'll consume it however you want.
I'm here for it.
Awesome, man. I'll give you the rest of your time back. I really appreciate it. It's great as always to see you and to chat and connect. And congratulations. That's like so exciting to hear this new project you're working on. And if I know you as well as I think you do, this will, if it hasn't already, this will obviously become just as much of a success as Thirst Project has been for the last decade and a half. So kudos. You're an inspiration to us all, you son of a bitch.
Love you, brother. So good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, man. Have a great rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon, brother.
Okay.
All right. See ya. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you, Seth. I always appreciate the time that we have to chat. Your story is incredible, and I'm so proud to be your friend. If you want to know more about how you can follow along and support the Thirst Project, head over to thirstproject.org or follow @Thirst Project on most social medias. And if you want to learn more and support Legacy Youth Leadership, head over to legacyyouthleadership.org or follow them on most social medias @LegacyYouthLead. If you want some extra time with Seth and I, again, it was just great to chat with an old friend. Head over to patreon.com/tellmeyours. If you want to follow us, Instagram and Twitter @tellmeyyourspod. Thank you again so much for listening. Tell your friends, subscribe, leave a comment, share your favorite story with us. And until next week, be kind to each other, and we'll talk soon.